Okay.
Yeah, we'll get into that.
Let's
Okay.
go ahead and read Book of Mormon. Let's do Book of Mormon. And listeners live, go ahead and post your concerns and questions about the Book of Mormon. Take it away, Trevor.
The first thing that I brought up was that I could start to see how a story could have been concocted by Joseph Smith that wasn't 100% original. This idea of Native Americans originating.
Wait, do you want to read your Book of Mormon point in the email?
I do want to read it, but there was one thing that we mentioned that wasn't in here that I wanted to get in first, and it was this whole thing on view of the Hebrews. Do you remember that?
Yeah. Go ahead and read what you wrote in the email and then talk about that.
Okay. I just said, similar to the Book of Abraham, there are 1769 King James Version edition errors in the Book of Mormon, errors unique to the Bible that Joseph Smith owned word for word. How could these have made it into an ancient record?
Okay.
That was my first point.
And then you went on to that was the Book of Mormon part?
This is just kind of one little point within the Book of Mormon. And then we kind of got into this discussion of, with the Bible, other books like View of the Hebrews, which Joseph Smith very, very likely would have had in his possession, written by Oliver Cowdery's pastor, has basically the story of the Book of Mormon in other words. This was a very popular tale at the time. And so the Bible, the View of the Hebrews, the language that was used in the late war that Joseph Smith most likely studied as a young boy, all of these things, you can start seeing them all come together, and you can see how Joseph Smith would have pieced together the Book of Mormon. A lot of people say, well, he was 14 years old. How can an uneducated farm boy do this? But he wasn't 14. He was in his 20s when this was happening. He was a smart guy. I mean, you got to give him that. Joseph Smith was brilliant, and he knew the Bible a lot more than we give him credit for. We say he's this stupid, uneducated boy, but it's like when you really get into a story and know Joseph Smith, you realize how smart he was and how much he knew about God and the Bible.
Right. Okay. So I'll recount now what I wrote down to be Grove's responses. His immediate response to View of the Hebrews and the late war was that go read them, was what he said. And he was basically saying, if you think Joseph got the Book of Mormon from View of the Hebrews, just go read View of the Hebrews, and it'll obviously prove to you that there's no real meaningful relation. And I thought it was cool because you actually said you had read from View of the Hebrews and from late war, maybe not all of it, but you had read from it. And anyway, that was an interesting exchange. But this is what apologists also say, is they say, well, it's not like he copied View of the Hebrew into the Book of Mormon, but I don't think anybody's really claiming that. It's just that the prevailing understanding in upstate New York in the 1830s about where Native Americans came from, for many, was that they came from Israel. And so that clearly was the truth that Joseph was pulling from to inspire the Book of Mormon. And there are themes in, not text, but themes in View of the Hebrews that clearly appear in the Book of Mormon. And that's all that people claim when they try and say that that View of the Hebrews inspired the Book of Mormon. And then, like you said in the discussion with Grow, the text from the late war sounds almost identical in terms of the, and it came to pass sort of language. The King James English of the late war reads in the very same sort of style as the Book of Mormon. And so then Grow goes on to basically give a Brigham Young quote where he says that Brigham Young said, "I wouldn't be stumbled if the prophet Joseph Smith translated 40 times the same text and it was different each time." And the way Grow summarized that was to say that God speaks in the language of the translators. He expresses it in the prophet's language. And so there's another argument that that Joseph only has the words that he has. Yeah. And so when he comes up with the Book of Mormon, he can only have the words that he has.
So when the words appear on the stone, how I understand it, and this is how it's stated in LDS.org, is that when he's looking at the seer stone, the words appeared
Right.
to him
Exactly.
almost glowing. Wouldn't he just write that down?
Exactly.
Would he
Exactly.
have to interpret that word and then translate it himself into a word that makes sense to him? That, you know what I mean? So that to me fell really kind of flat for me.
Totally. Totally. He goes on to give a quote from Gibbons, which is that God intentionally leaves this evidence muddled so that there's a role of faith involved. Now, again, fine if that's your view of God, that God provides some evidence, but not a lot of evidence, and then a lot of counter evidence so that you can like spend your existence sort of trying to make sense of it all and then need to believe in something that isn't necessarily testable or true. And that's literally like the main test of your mortal existence, that you'll put your faith in some extraterrestrial being that these super flawed prophets tell you exists and are true. And if you're not willing to ignore the real evidence and believe on the words of these men who want your money, that somehow you fail the test. And it's an interesting view of God. But that's basically what Terrell Gibbons and Grow are basically saying, is God intentionally makes it hard and confusing so that there's a role for faith. And again, I guess it depends on your view of God. Trevor, you responded by saying that it's just too muddled, that science matters, there's evidence, there's logic, there's DNA, and that faith is fine, but that faith shouldn't be required, in spite of the evidence, that faith should sit along with the evidence, and then someone can believe if the thing that they're believing in has at least some substance to back it up. And you just...
Well, yeah, John, I mean, the thing is, and I brought this up to Matt, I said, do you believe that if we did not have Jerusalem today, right? Or any evidence that the people of the Bible, actually existed, that Jesus Christ may have actually existed, do you believe we would have as many Christians as we have today? I highly doubt that, because it would be a completely fictional place. We have the Roman Empire. We have the Egyptian pyramids. I mean, it's not crazy to think that that these people would be leaving behind some trace. My biggest thing, and obviously Matt Groh, he's not an archaeologist, and so he was doing his best. He gave me some resources, but the biggest thing for me was the fact that there is no archaeological evidence to directly support the Book of Mormon, or the Nephites, Lamanites, who numbered in the millions. And I bring up the fact that on Hill Cumorah, there was supposedly a war of a couple million people that happened. Why are there zero traces of hair, bones, swords,
shields,
armor,
helmets, chariots, armor,
just anything, just one thing, and it's not just that, but anywhere, and in my email, I talk a lot about Thomas Ferguson, who was part of the New World Archaeological organization that was actually, he was part of BYU's archaeological division. From what I understand, he was contracted by the church to go out and find archaeological evidence. And after 17 years of trying to dig up evidence for the Book of Mormon, he said, you can't set the Book of Mormon geography down anywhere because it's fictional and it will never meet the requirements of dirt archaeology, and so it just doesn't confirm what's in the book. I can get it when people say, well, it's a faith, it's a faith promoting book. There's some good stories in there that we can really learn from. They're, maybe parables or something, but to actually believe that it happened, that it's historic fact.
Yeah.
That's
Totally.
tough. That's
totally.
Tough.
And this was where I think Grow, one of the weakest points for Grow, because basically he brings up the work of John Sorensen. And, John Sorensen is a professor at BYU. I don't know if he's an anthropologist or an archaeologist, exactly what it is, but he definitely has a PhD from a reputable school. But at the same time, if you reference the Mormon Stories episode that I did with Michael Coe, who's a Yale-trained archaeologist, who is a specialist in Mesoamerica during the time that the Book of Mormon takes place, just go back and listen to that episode. Michael Coe, C-O-E. I asked him, were there metal swords? He says no. Were there horses? No. Were there cattle? No. Were there sheep? No. Wheels, chariots, he goes, wheat, barley. He basically just makes it very obvious that there is not a shred of meaningful, credible archaeological evidence to bolster the Book of Mormon. And anyone who really understands and is objective about this issue will realize that John Sorensen, I'm sure he's a lovely man. I'm sure that John Sorensen is smart. I'm sure that his degree is credible. But there's not a non-Mormon archaeologist anywhere that would back up the things that John Sorensen writes in his books, like the Mormon Codex, I think it's called, where he tries to shoehorn cherry-picked archaeological, anthropological evidence to demonstrate the truthfulness of the Book of Mormon. If it were even worthy of consideration by non-Mormon archaeologists and apologists, which it's not, it would be a laughingstock. And so for Grow and then Clarke to kind of say, hey, there's this smart guy at BYU who's got a PhD, who's written this book that no one really understands, just trust that, and you don't need to worry about all the others that would say that it's sort of a laughingstock. I felt like that was a weak part of Grow's and Clarke's response.
Yeah, I mean, it was disappointing to me as well, but he did preface saying he's not an archaeologist. This is not his expertise. You know what I mean? So he did just kind of pass me off to a source that he believes is the best source. And unfortunately, it is John Sorensen. That was kind of where he was pointing me to. And having looked at John Sorensen a little bit prior to that, I knew already what that was going to look like. I didn't spend a lot of time reading John Sorensen stuff because very early on I could see it was a lot of theory and interpretation from a member of the church, and that's not so much what I was interested in. Anybody can have theories, and I didn't look into theories on the stuff that was going against the church's view. You know what I mean? So I'm just looking at stuff that actually makes sense.
Yeah, totally.
So
totally. The other thing we just have to acknowledge about Sorensen is that he has a conflict of interest. His salary, his pension is all tied to him bolstering the Book of Mormon claims. His job is dependent on that. He would be fired immediately from BYU if he started telling people the church wasn't true and the archaeology doesn't match up. So he's cherry picking evidence to prove his faith-based beliefs with zero credibility in sort of a peer-reviewed, objective way. So I do think it's fair that Grow mentions him. I just don't think it's a very credible thing to refer people to. And it's a common tactic to say, a smart guy has done all the thinking, so you don't really have to. And I don't like that approach. It's what they did with Hugh Nibley, and it's what they're doing with John Sorensen. And John Sorensen nor Hugh Nibley were credible. And we know now through Mormon leaks that the church actually disregarded Hugh Nibley's apologetics in some instances. Quickly, go ahead.
I was going to say Matt Grow did make a good point with the DNA analysis, I thought. Kind of an original thing that I had never heard before. Because, I came in saying that DNA analysis has concluded that Native American Indians do not originate from the Middle East or from Israelites, but rather from Asia through the Bering Strait. His thing was, I thought his strongest point was that we don't know what Lehi's DNA would have been.
Okay,
I know that's a stretch, but it was something new that I'd never heard, right?
And just because I've been dealing with these things more. I heard that at a fair conference, like back in 2005, 2006, 2007. I don't remember the exact date, but that's been around a long time. But again, I just want to call attention to something. Apologists are always trying to find the gaps and say that we don't know for sure. They're trying to create plausible deniability. They're trying to make the target as small as possible so that then they can still create the possibility of belief. And just refer to the wonderful DNA episodes that Jamie Hannes Handy did for Mormon Stories. It's just not credible. If I can guarantee you something, if the DNA tests of Native Americans were to have shown that somehow Native Americans had DNA that matched what we expect Israel DNA to have been in 600 BC, the church would be going bananas over it. And showing that it proved the church was true. Just like with the Book of Abraham. If it turned out that Joseph's translation of the Book of Abraham, and Egyptian Book of Abraham, had been factual, the church would have said, game over, the church is true. But because the evidence doesn't go in their favor, they're going to say, oh, well, maybe there are other massive populations in ancient America that unfortunately, strangely, the Book of Mormon never talks about. Maybe that DNA swamped all the DNA of the Lehites. And again, if that's true, they mentioned Zoramites, they mentioned Ulikites, they mentioned Jaredites. Why would they not have mentioned in the Book of Mormon this massive population that would have ended up swamping their DNA? And again, of course, we don't have samples of Lehi's DNA, but how convenient is that for the church to then say, oh, okay, since we don't have hair from Lehi, because Lehi didn't exist, by the way, then we don't know what his DNA was, and so we can't ever really know what to expect the DNA to be. It's typical apologetics making the target so small that you can't disprove it.
And wasn't it interesting as well when I said, well, didn't it used to say in the introduction of the Book of Mormon that because they talked about, well, they don't know how many people were already here, you know what I mean? Like the DNA could have been lost, or whatever. And I pointed to the fact that I remember growing up reading in the introduction of the Book of Mormon that these were the primary ancestors.
Principal ancestors, yeah.
Or the principal ancestors.
Yeah.
So that to me doesn't sound like, and I know since then they've changed that, but what was most concerning, instead of actually addressing that, it was more they kind of took the route of, well, yeah, but that's not Joseph Smith's, right? Like that's not.
Yeah, there was a committee that in 1920 that put that introduction in there, and you very rightly asserted, yeah, it was probably a committee that was approved by the prophet at the time.
Well,
which
and that's
is true.
the thing.
Yeah.
That's the thing, right?
But it's not just that. It's that Joseph Smith himself sent missionaries to the Native Americans to convert them, because he was telling everyone that the Native Americans were the pure blood of Israel. The whole Book of Mormon, this is a point that Brent Metcalf made in my interview with him. The Book of Mormon says that its main purpose is to bring the Native Americans, the Lamanites, the descendants of Lehi, to bring the gospel back to them. And so if the Book of Mormon's express claim is to bring Lamanites to Christ, if Joseph Smith himself is sending missionaries to American Indians to convert them because they're the pure blood of Israel, then are we supposed to now go, oh, well, Joseph misunderstood the fundamental purpose of the Book of Mormon. Joseph misunderstood who Lamanites were. This committee in 1920 misunderstood, but now in 2017, we're supposed to go, oh, okay, now the prophets are getting it right, when for over 150 years, they had no clue who the Lamanites even were. Again, who are the Lamanites? It's the shrinking target.
Yeah.
Where the Lamanites are disappearing. We don't talk about them anymore. Spencer Kimball used to care about the Lamanites. Now we don't care about them anymore. We've changed the Lamanite Generation Performing Group to now be some other name, because now we just kind of don't want to ever talk about Lamanites because it's all of a sudden inconvenient.
Well,
when it was the foundational understanding of Joseph Smith and the purpose of the Book of Mormon to be for the Native Americans that everyone knew were the descendants of Lehi.
My wife is from Bolivia, and she's still trying to get over the fact that she might not be a Lamanite. When I served a mission 15 years ago, that was very clear to all of us missionaries that we are preaching to the to the Lamanite, the ancestors. We would actually tell people that, like, these are your ancestors. This book, you need to know this, you know? And so, and then when, I mean, you can get into a lot of other things with that are derogatory that I'm really surprised that people actually don't see. But again, you know, most of these people that we're, you know, talking to in Latin America are so nice and humble and loving. They would never even be defensive on the fact, you know, but to me, I always kind of felt like the church was talking about them as if they were a lesser people. And I always, yeah, like you said, it was always kind of a touchy thing for me, you know. I never felt comfortable talking about it in that sense. But anyway, yeah, but it is assumed, I think, very much. And so
really quick, I want to go to some of the comments for our live listeners. We have 210 live listeners right now, which is a great number. So people are finding value in this conversation. Eric writes that you have awesome hair, Trevor. So I just want to, that's a really important substantive conversation.
Let's talk about that for a while. I like where that conversation's going.
Yeah. I think it's really important. Someone writes down below, they remind us about the words, you know, when Grow was saying Joseph only has the words that he has. And so, of course, the Book of Mormon says horse when it was probably something else like a tapir, or of course it's, you know, maybe elephant when it wasn't an elephant, but that's not true. One of our listeners reminds us that the words, you know, Kurlam and Kumamon, or whatever those words are, some of the words for currency, like C9 or whatever, Joseph is creating words that don't exist in his context. And that's because he's claiming that he's seeing in a stone the words that are actually written. So this defense that Joseph can only use the words that he has, it's not a really credible response. And it was Bruce that wrote, if God's using Joseph's words, where did the words Kurlam and Kumam come from? Do
you not use that in your everyday vocabulary, John?
Kurlam and Kumam? I can't even pronounce it. Debbie writes, if the words appeared on the stone like words written on a piece of parchment, why were there so many errors that had to be fixed later? Did God not know the word horse? Did God not know the correct translation of the Isaiah passages that mysteriously have the same errors as those that the King James Version translators mistranslated in the Book of Mormon? Those are really good points. There are other points about DNA. So I'm just going to go up. Heath writes, we do know what Lehi's cultural DNA markers were. The argument is only used to confuse people who think you need to have an individual present to know their DNA profile. That's a really good point, Heath. Super glad that you're joining us. Bruce writes, the Book of Mormon says the brass plates told Nephi that he, Lehi, and their ancestors came from Joseph. So that seems to be Semitic. That's a really good point. Alice writes, one of the issues I kind of had with the interview, no, we're going to talk about polygamy later. Aaron says the DNA could be Jewish, a perfect match, but if it is from thousands of years before Nephi came, it doesn't matter. Spencer writes, anachronisms in the Book of Mormon is another blow to its claims of historicity. Heath writes, Book of Mormon internal prophecies indicate that the seed of Lehi will be preserved. Seed indicates direct blood descendants or DNA. And Heath, that's a really, really important point. Aaron writes, don't forget the revelations to marry Lamanite women as concubines to turn their skin white and delicate. Yes, that's an important point. Joseph Smith, when apologists try to defend polygamy, because we have Joseph having sex with Fanny Alger somewhere around 1835, if the revelation for polygamy, which became D&C 132, didn't even get written down until sometime in the Nauvoo time period in 1840s, apologists, you know, critics are like, well, why is Joseph sleeping with Fanny Alger in 1835, 5 to 7, 8 years before the D&C 132 is even revealed? What apologists go back to was this 1831 version of a revelation that Joseph received, where he's basically telling his missionaries to go out to get Native American wives to enter into plural relationships with them, because many of them were married, and that through children or progeny from those relationships, that their skin would be turned white and delightsome. So again, that's Joseph having a very clear view that Native Americans were direct descendants of Lehi, and that their skin was to be turned white and delightsome. And that's when Jasmine's comment comes in. Jasmine says, I'm Mexican, and to continue perpetuating the Book of Mormon as a historical fact is racist. And she uses the terms racist in capital letters. It is, Book of Mormon is a racist document, and the teachings from the Book of Mormon are racist, and perpetuating the Book of Mormon as a historical document is a huge disservice to your wife and to people in the Pacific Islands and to all the Native Americans out there.
I couldn't agree more. And you know, another thing is people are like, well, why are you all of a sudden so interested in DNA and archaeology and all this kind of stuff? And it's not like all of a sudden I'm like having a special interest in it. It's just my entire life, I assumed that we had enough archaeological evidence on our side and logic. I had seen these giant books, you know, like John Sorensen's, that's like, you know, Book of Mormon Archaeology Explained or something, you know, and you just assume, like, I'm not going to read that giant fat book, but you just assume that we had enough on our side. It actually blew my mind when at 35 years old, John, at 35 years old, like, and I know I'm not the only one. I mean, there's some people older than me that are just coming to this realization, like, wait a minute, there is zero archaeological evidence to support the Book of Mormon. Like, what? Like, this, to me, a lot of people point to the Book of Abraham as the smoking gun, but to me, this was it for me. And what I told Matt was this was the domino that just kind of started everything for me, you know, just kind of tipped everything.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just going to also just add, Bethany writes, thank you for discussing the racism. And Jasmine writes, please talk about how Book of Mormon historicity is a race issue, and that not framing it that it was is perpetuating racism. It promotes erasure for Latino identities. So Jasmine, we're super grateful that and Bethany and others, we're super grateful you're bringing up the race issue. That's really important. Gracie writes, Jasmine, you're correct. I grew up believing I was a descendant of Lehi because I'm Mexican, and somehow I was cursed for being brown. That's just kind of a disgusting, racist, awful thing. And the Book of Mormon still's got all that language, that it hasn't changed. But somehow apologists are okay with that. They're kind of like, these are not the droids you're looking for. Okay, really quick. Going back to the interview, you get frustrated at this point. It's around the 41-minute mark. And you basically just say, man, don't the Quorum of 15 talk to God? Because, you know, as soon as everything gets redefined in the committee in 1920 was right until it was wrong, and then the committee gets reversed in the 1990s or 2000s, you're just exasperated by this point. And of course, Gross says, well, what does that mean to talk to God? And that's when Clarke jumps in. And again, it's worth noting that Clarke doesn't actually speak up until 39 minutes into the hour and 20-minute conversation. But Clarke does speak up at this point, and he starts invoking the blacks in the priesthood thing. And he starts incorporating sort of Greg Prince's narrative, which we all have the benefit from now, which is that it wasn't doctrine, like the First Presidency sort of signed a document saying that the black priesthood ban was doctrine, which I think happened in the 1950s. You guys can find that source document. But Clarke says it was a process. It was David O. McKay struggling with it and talking to people and trying to build a coalition. And it was a still small voice that came to Kimball.
I didn't even understand where he was going with that, actually, when he started talking about that.
They were basically saying revelation doesn't come by God picking up by prophets picking up the bat phone and talking to God. Revelation comes through the still small voice that can be misunderstood. And Trevor, it's just like you and me. When we try and talk to God, we all see through a glass darkly. And
well,
and so
is that what the rest of the members of the church assume and
no,
believe?
that
Because
that's
that's not what I assumed.
that's the problem. And that's again the apologists backtracking and trying to define down what a prophet means. Now all of a sudden well, they're trying to have it both ways, because later in the interview they're like, well, yes, prophets can talk to God, and there definitely can be direct revelation. But again, conveniently, whenever the revelation turns out to be wrong or racist, then all of a sudden it's like, oh, well, prophets see through a glass darkly. And, you know, they have this still small voice that can sometimes be misinterpreted. And in the interview, you're like, well, what the freak is the use of a prophet? Those are my words, not yours. If the communication is so dark and confusing.
You're taking the words out of my mind, what I was thinking.
Okay, good. I'm channeling you in a spiritual way instead of in a scholarly way.
Well, John, it gets to the point where it gets frustrating, right? Like you say about 40 minutes, it was a very, kind conversation. It was open. I was agreeing with them and a lot of their things. Again, I didn't have time or really want to debate the facts with them. That, it was more to get their take and their belief on things. But it gets to a point when it builds up so much that I just got so frustrated that I'm just like, well, why even have a prophet then? I mean, if we're saying right now, if Elder Clarke is saying that, no, actually the prophet receives revelation just like you and I, or it's not too different than you and I receive revelation, that's really scary to me. And that, I mean, I guess it makes sense why there's been no prophecy, if that's the way it's going. But I always believed, when I served a mission, I believed, man, there was that what was it, the 15 witnesses video around the time of Gordon B. Hinckley, and they're looking into the camera and they're saying, I know Jesus Christ lives. And you could see it in their eyes, and they want you to assume they have had this intimate, call it a conversation, call it a meeting or visitation or whatever. But I don't think I'm the only one that believed that these men are actually conversing or communicating with God in a different way or a higher.
No, it's the story that we all bought into, and all the people that the missionary discussion shows Joseph kneeling in a grove of trees and God and Jesus appearing above them. And
but
again, it's
sorry, John. But I was just going to say, I need to throw this in before I forget, is another thing he says was, but at the end of the day, there's really no way to know. And I was like, I mean, we could ask him.
Yeah. And so again, in the interview, we've got Grow wanting it both ways. He's saying that there are dramatic spiritual outpourings, but oftentimes it's through a process where they see darkly. And then Clarke jumps in around the 43-minute mark and says, we can never understand how it happened, but it happened. And then he says, he kind of changes the conversation and says, but prophets keep us going in the right direction. And then for me, what was one of the major low points for the entire conversation is around the 43-minute mark, where he says, Trevor, what's the chances of keeping your kids in the right direction without the church? And then he just does this insulting move where he says, in the church, we have problems, but out of the church, they really have problems. And then he mentions some Jewish guy, and I don't remember exactly what he says about the Jewish guy. Those are his words, not mine. But he's basically making the point that you're never going to be able to raise healthy, happy kids outside of the church. You can only raise healthy, happy kids inside the church. And I'll just say it again. I think people deserve a special place in spirit prison for using this fear-based approach to tell people you'll never find happiness and your kids will be prostitutes and drug addicts if you try and raise them out of the church. So how did that strike you?
All I can tell you is how it made me feel. It was kind of the bully approach. I felt like, kind of like that talk, I believe was Elder Ballard. Where will you go?
Yeah.
Right? Kind of what will you do? And it is. And honestly, I felt that. I have felt that going through my transition. There's a fear of, because you've lived your entire life with the church. You don't know what life is like outside of the church. and they make it seem, very scary. They want to paint this picture of a world that is full of just violence and rape. And I mean, I don't know, but you leave the church and it's game over for you. And that's simply not the case. I've actually found that as I've distanced myself from the church, I've been able to connect with a higher power and be more spiritual, be able to actually step outside of this little box that they've created for me. You know what I mean? And so now since I've been able to experience so many positive things outside the church, now I can look at that as being something very abusive. Does that make sense? That mentality, it's very unhealthy, to say that you cannot have happiness. Children cannot be good people without religion, and more specifically the LDS Church in their life.
Yeah, that is literally what an abusive spouse says to keep the abused spouse put. They say, I made you, you'll never be happy and healthy without me, you'll never survive. That's the type of abusive rhetoric that keeps an abused spouse in a relationship.
Is this where we talked about prophecy, John? Should we go into that?
Yeah, let me just read a couple comments really quick. Phoebe writes, we all have personal revelation unless it contradicts the leadership's revelations. She says, what about praying to know if the Book of Mormon is not true? When can those that have done it, that become significant? So the brethren, if we receive a witness that confirms what the brethren's teaching, well, then that's a true witness. But if it ever confirms something that isn't what the brethren say, well, then that's Satan, or that's a false witness. And that's a really good point, Phoebe. Cameron writes,
according to Packer, there's 3 ways you can feel the Spirit, right? It's either your own feelings, the Holy Ghost, or the devil.
Yeah.
But how can I discern if the devil can dress up like the Holy Ghost?
I mean, it's just a God.
What kind of mechanism is that? It's not
a weird type of God. Cameron writes, I hate the rhetoric that it's impossible to have good morals without religion. It is absolutely consulting. That's absolutely true. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead. So like you said, the conversation then turns to Jeremy Runnells. And again, around the 44-minute mark, the discussion about Jeremy Runnells, it happens in sort of 2 different parts, but it's one of the most insulting parts of the interview. He basically assassinates Jeremy's character in a couple places. The first time, he basically says, I read somewhere that Jeremy promised that he wasn't going to publish CES letter until his mother died, but then he published it before his mother died. And he basically said, what kind of despicable, these are my words, what kind of despicable human being would dishonor their parents that way? Of course, that's a problem because, what about the things Joseph Smith did to his own wife? But let's ignore that. That's because Jeremy Runnells is an evil human being. And then you very, very lovingly came to Jeremy's defense and basically said, I think Jeremy wanted to share his truth with loved ones. Isn't that a good impulse? If you've discovered truth, isn't that good to want to share it? And then this is one of the very most important points that my buddy Christian wanted to make sure that I emphasized. One of the weird things that Clarke does is he basically says, I admit that the church misled people for over a century on its historical narrative. Now, those are his words, but if you go back and listen to it, he admits that the church gave a false narrative. And this is exactly what Richard Bushman told people recently in a fireside, that the predominant historical narrative the church has taught is unsustainable. That's what Clarke agreed to. And then he said, oh, but now the church with its essays is now putting out an even and a balanced sort of representation of the historical record, which to my understanding, most of the historical people that read the essays feel like they are not fair and accurate in their laying out. But then he turns it back on Jeremy and he says, well, Jeremy doesn't do that. He doesn't lay out a fair treatment of the pros and the cons. And it's just a not credible treatment. So what did you think about his early statements about Jeremy Runnells?
Well, it's kind of like as if somebody were to say, well, I'm just going to look at Joseph Smith look at his character, and then I'm going to decide whether or not I should read the Book of Mormon or not. Right? It's kind of backwards. And so it doesn't make sense to me, because he actually comes out and says that he hasn't read the CES letter in its entirety. He's brushed over it. He kind of gets it, right? But he hasn't really looked into it. But it seems like he's really looked into Jeremy's backstory. And I think, again, that's where, a lot of times these apologists turn to, is attacking personal character. The thing with me, though, and I said this, was the difference between, attacking Jeremy Runnells versus attacking Joseph Smith is one of these people are self-proclaiming to have seen God, to be a prophet of God, and starting a religion. One of them is simply asking questions.
Yeah. Beautifully
That's the
said.
difference. Yeah.
Beautifully said. Michelle writes, I'm watching live from Provincetown, Massachusetts, with no personal connection to Mormonism, just a lifelong curiosity about these beliefs you are discussing. She says, thanks for the masterclass. That's high praise from Michelle in Massachusetts, who's never been Mormon.
Wow.
Bill Porter writes, most of my friends outside of the church behave better than some in the church. Amy writes, religion is full of moral relativity and immaturity. Jace writes, all children are born atheists. A lot of people like the comparison of the abusive mentality when they tell people you'll never find happiness outside of the church. Summer writes, it was my number one fear when my sister-in-law told me she no longer believed. I thought, quote, how is she going to raise her kids without it? Now that I'm out, Summer says, it's easy to see the beauty of raising my kids so differently, free to be whoever they want to be. And a lot of people are just really upset that Clarke would basically say that you can't raise happy, healthy kids. Fred writes, saying it's worse outside of the church, ? The presumptuous arrogance of those people is just staggering. And Cameron writes, I hate the rhetoric that it's impossible to have good morals without religion. It's absolutely insulting. And I just think every prophet, seer, revelator, quorum of 70, bishop, stake president needs to get that point, that they're being deeply offensive and abusive when they use that rhetoric.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Couldn't agree more.
Okay. It goes on to a discussion about FAIR, the apologetic group. They make it very clear that FAIR is not funded by the church. But what they do is they go, hey, FAIR is just a bunch of good people, good men and women trying to do the best they can. Again, they're going to imbue on FAIR people these really altruistic, pleasant, happy, good motives when they were just willing to throw, or at least Clarke, and I think Groh does it too, willing to throw Jeremy Runnells under the bus. Was
Elder Clarke's point about why Jeremy Runnells' character was in question, was that even, I don't know, was that even convincing to anybody else? That's what I would love to ask people. I mean, that he didn't respect, Elder Clarke says, well, I just can't imagine listening to somebody that wouldn't respect a dying mother's wishes. That was...
No, it's a typical ad hominem attack. If you don't have a strong argument, you attack the person who's making the counter argument. It's typical Mormon apologetics. Farms did it. Maxwell Institute did it. FAIR does it. FAIR tries not to do it anymore. But clearly, Mormon general authorities and historians are still doing it behind closed doors. And they do it with John DeLynn. They do it with Kate Kelly. They did it with Von Brody. They did it with Michael Quinn. They did it with Simon Southerton. Oh, they're adulterers. Oh, they're child molesters. Oh, they're, they don't love their moms. They kill little kiddies and torture them. They'll use any justification they can to associate evil with the critic so that you won't consider their argument.
Well, and as disturbing as this whole conversation was, believe it or not, it got worse. When I said, well, Jeremy Runnells isn't, professing to be anything more than a man with questions. And he's, it's not like he's running a religion here. And Elder Clarke very, very adamantly says, oh, yes, he is. And I'm kind of shocked by it. I was like, oh, oh, what do you mean by that? And he says, well, he's running the anti-Mormon religion.
Yeah. Yeah. And that was at the 53-minute mark. Super disgusting. He says that Jeremy Runnells tells you to follow him. And it's just a disgusting, awful. Jeremy Runnells is a good man. And what people should do is say, critics have credible concerns. They're generally honest people just trying to discover what's true. We may disagree with them, but we're not going to malign their character. And it's something that apologists and historians who work for the church don't yet have the integrity to admit. And so they use ad hominem, and it's really disgusting. There's no other word for it.
Right.
Okay, let's jump to the issue number 4 that you wrote in your email, which is about the witnesses.
Okay. So we started talking about the witnesses, and kind of how I let off on this was, and I'm not sure if when the last time you may have gone to the Church History Museum, but for me, I hadn't gone since I'd gone through this whole crisis, and I remember it being such a beautiful museum. And so when I walked in, I was just wondering, I wonder how my perspective will have changed now, understand a little bit more. And so when I walked in, the first thing that I saw were these sculpture kind of art renditions of the witnesses. And there's the 3 witnesses there around a rock, and they're all, they're flipping through the pages of the golden plates. And that to me just automatically gave me a really sick feeling inside, because for somebody that's investigating the church, right, it gives off a feeling of that literally happened when it didn't. And so, if you're already in the church and you're aware of the fact that they only saw the plates in vision, and maybe they had this experience in vision, and maybe this whole rendition is just a dream, right? That's one thing. But I think that people believe when they see stuff like that, that literally happened, right? And so I talked about that, and I talked about, and then this is what I wrote in the email. I said, my testimony in the Book of Mormon leaned not completely, but heavily on the fact that 11 witnesses had seen and or touched the plates, and I was relying on these men as credible witnesses. I was surprised to learn, however, that not one person by their account have ever seen them with their physical eyes or touched them. The witnesses, by their own admission, seem to have only seen the angel and plates in a visionary state in their minds, as Joseph suggested to them, and not really with their natural eyes, as most members are taught. So why would real metal plates need to be seen in a vision or with spiritual eyes, as many of the witnesses later testified?
Right.
That was my.
And there was, and so, the response was basically, there was a discussion about, whether or not it's true that all of the witnesses ended up following Strang. John Hamer made the point that Emma didn't follow Strang. And someone mentioned, I think it was Grow, that Cowdery didn't become a Strangite. I don't think that totally matters. I think your bigger point was, if these witnesses are so credible, why are they following the next goofball who claims to be a prophet and who claims to manufacture scripture? How can they be credible? You also go on to talk about, there was some debate from Grow about whether or not the witnesses saw with their natural eyes versus touch with their hands, what was claimed, what wasn't. I think reasonable people can debate whether or not the record shows that people were claiming spiritual eyes versus real eyes, a vision versus a real experience, touching versus not touching. The point I think you were trying to make is there are a lot of questions about how real these experiences were versus sort of imagined. But I think you then spoke up to a more important point, which was Joseph Smith ended up eviscerating the credibility. Number one, most of the people that followed Joseph ended up leaving the church. That's true with Oliver Cowdery, Martin Harris, the Whitmers. That's true with Hiram Page, I believe. That's true with those other 8 witnesses, that whole family. And Joseph eviscerated them, their credibility. He called, you mentioned that he calls Cowdery, what did he call Cowdery?
a counterfeit, a liar, a
Yeah.
thief.
Yeah, Martin Harris was a buffoon. You know, Joseph assassinated the character of anyone who ended up leaving the church, including the 3 and the 8 witnesses that weren't Smiths, basically.
Well,
And so
yeah.
the point that you made is, how can we rely on these witnesses if they're following Strang, if they're eviscerated by Joseph as being liars and adulterers and cheaters?
Well, it comes down to this idea of convenience again. And thinking back to, my time in the church, and, anytime the witnesses were brought up, they were always talked about as, definitely put up on kind of a higher, chair, if you will, just as good, honest, like Abe Lincoln type people, you know what I mean? And then later, anytime you talk about something that might, be, put them in a negative light, then it's brought up like, oh, well, Joseph Smith did say that this guy was, a liar, counterfeit, thief, all that kind of stuff. So that probably explains that. So again, it goes back to this convenience thing, right? When they were in favor of it, they were the best men ever, the most honest people ever. As soon as they testify against it, right, or say something to make people doubt, I should say, that's probably more accurate. It's like, oh, well, they were liars and counterfeiters anyway. So does that make sense? It goes back to that. There's a theme going on here of convenience and contradiction.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm going to bring in some comments from our listeners. Spencer also, Bethany writes that the essays are completely whitewashed. That's a good point. Spencer invokes, reminds us that it's the ad hominem fallacy. Don't attack the person, critique the ideas. I think Joseph used ad hominem when the witnesses were against him, like you say, but when the witnesses were for him, like you say, the witnesses were awesome. Chelsea writes, I choose to live a life without fear. Kimberly writes the point, wasn't Joseph Smith raised outside of Mormonism? That's, again, to this point about, can good people be raised outside of Mormonism? Gabe makes a really good point. We are encouraged to read the Book of Mormon and use it to judge if Joseph is a true prophet. However, we are discouraged from looking at Joseph's history and past. How come an individual like Jeremy Runnells doesn't get the same courtesy? In other words, why don't the brethren just say, yeah, check out the CES letter, pray about it. If it seems true, if it inspires you, then you have your witness. But the brethren, again, don't want to steer you in any way that would allow you to make a conclusion that doesn't support what they want to say. Joshua writes, church leaders should know that the glow of the Spirit doesn't shine from a gaslight. Treating Jeremy that way is deplorable. That is good poetic prose, Joshua. Thank you for writing. Other people are attacking the ad hominem. They're really frustrated with that. Andrew writes, Jeremy Runnells' character is impeccable. Meeting him in person will clear that up for anyone who has questions in regards to his motives. I've met Jeremy many, many times, and I've found his character.
Well, that's the difference. We can actually give Jeremy a call. We can meet with him. We can talk to Jeremy. We can't talk to Joseph, right? We have no idea really how bad it was, and so. Yeah.
Greg Kearney writes really quickly. Greg Kearney is a great guy. He's one of the first people I interviewed in Mormon Stories. I interviewed him about Masonry. He's been a supporter of FAIR, I think, in the past. Maybe he still is. Greg writes, no, now, John, I have never personally attacked you or anyone else. Gregory, I've never claimed that you've attacked me. FAIR has had a history of ad hominem in the past, and I think I did say that they're trying to clean that up. I think there's an instance with Scott Gordon last year where he kind of blew that, but I believe him, and I take him and others at their word that FAIR is trying to clean that up. My sister and my brother-in-law are part of FAIR. I think there's a lot of good people at FAIR. My point was, historically, ad hominem has been a classic go-to tool for apologists. And then Christina writes, the bishop from the pulpit told the ward not to associate with my family after they left. So Christina's dad was my second counselor in the stake presidency in Houston when he left the church. Tina was told, the bishop told the members of the ward not to associate with the Prince family after the Prince family left. Many rumored that Bill Prince had lost his mind. Even his own parents told the other siblings that he had lost his mind and went crazy because he had left the church. So Bill's parents, Doug Prince, told their children that their son Bill had lost his mind and went crazy. So again, rank and file members look to church leaders and apologists, learn ad hominem, and then they do it to each other as well.
Right.
It's a really ugly sort of residual of the human experience and of patriarchy. And I think it's just a crappy way that apologists try and justify what they do.
And one thing I want to kind of touch on, and this was somebody's comment about the CS letter, about Jeremy Runnells, his credibility and all that, but it got me thinking about the CS letter in general, that it's sad, but this is what I see going on right now, especially with my circle, is that people have seen that the CS letter is so powerful in drawing people away from the church, that instead of taking the stance, well, go ahead. I mean, we're open to information. We're open to truth. And actually, I talked about that with Elder Clarke, and he said, I think we would agree with that we are all searching for truth. Wouldn't the approach that would be a little more effective be, well, go ahead and read the CES letter and pray about it. It's a personal thing. Look into it, talk to God, and receive your own personal revelation on it. But instead, they take this approach that is very much fear-based again, that the CS letter is of the devil. And it's a slippery slope. And as soon as you read it, the devil will creep into your mind, or his spirit will overtake you, and you will have a exorcism or something. I don't understand their mentality on that, but the word is definitely going around, as far as what I've heard. People in the church are saying the CS letter is of the devil. And I don't think that's an effective approach for them to take.
Absolutely. A lot of really good comments coming in. I'm gonna refer to them in a bit. Let's go ahead and return. Okay, so one of the really important points for me was at the 52-minute and 20 mark, right in the middle of the conversation about Jeremy Runnells. Basically, Elder Clarke makes one of the biggest points, I think, for you, Trevor, of this whole takeaway. He basically points to Grow, and he says, this is why I bring Grow into this conversation. He basically says, I'm not that smart. I don't have time to spend a lot of time on these issues and to delve into them. So what we do as general authorities is bring in the smart people like Patrick Mason, like Grow, like Fluman, like John Gee, like Hugh Nibley, Sorensen, Bushman, Givens, and we basically point to the smart people to explain all this away. How did you receive sort of that admission by Clarke that the brethren have to point to the smart scholars to explain this stuff?
Scary, I think, would be the word. I mean, here's the thing. I don't doubt that he is busy. But at the end of the day, he works for the church. I would think that his number one responsibility would be to be familiar with this stuff as a high-ranking leader and official of the church. Look, I'm busy. I don't work for the church. I have a career. I have a young family. But still, in a short 6-month time frame, I've been able to assemble all of this knowledge on these subjects in my spare time. Every night, 2-3 hours a night, I look into it. I read something. I'm educating myself. So for him to use that cop-out, for me, was really kind of scary. It showed me, actually, that more than anything, that there was a lack of care and interest, in really knowing these things. And it was very revealing to me that these prophets and apostles are leaning very heavily on these apologists, historians, to kind of do the job for them. And I think that's a little backwards in a lot of ways. Because if these men, I mean, what would be more powerful? Finding somebody that went to Notre Dame, or talking to the guy that's having direct communication with God?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's supposed to be from the prophet that you read the truth. And the scholars, it's also interesting how when a learned scholar criticizes the church, well, that's pride and that's the learnings of men. But when a scholar validates the church's point of view, well, here's a smart, honorable, good man who supports what we're saying. They always kind of, again, want it both ways.
Yeah, and another thing that was brought up was, well, we can always do tit for tat. That was said several times, kind of tit for tat kind of thing. To me, these issues are not tit for tat. I mean, these are giant, like, earth-shattering concerns and issues that we have. And I'm not talking about little events in time that have happened to some more of these obscure prophets. I'm talking about the cornerstone, or the basic foundation of our faith, and that's Joseph Smith in the Book of Mormon. And I think all of us, everybody as members of the church, but especially the leaders of the church, should know how to answer these questions.
Absolutely. You're right. It's a cop-out for them to say, I don't have time, I'm too busy administering the church. People's faith is based on evidence. It's based on factual historical claims. And if that's the case, if you're going to be a general authority, if you're going to be an apostle or a first presidency member, if you're going to represent the church, apologize for the church, encourage people to join the church, you should know its history very, very well. And if, like you said, Trevor, if 20 or 40 or 50,000 Mormon Stories listeners, or 50,000 CES letter readers, or 100,000 CES letter readers can take time from their busy schedule as having day jobs, as being parents, whatever they are, in school, and we can take the time to learn this stuff, so can members of the Quorum of the 70, so can the First Presidency, and they should. It's their duty, I think, and it's a cop-out when they don't. I'm going to just read some other really good comments from our listeners really quick. Phoebe, when we were talking about can the 8 and the 3 witnesses have been reliable, she says, stop for a second and think, can 12 to 15 people coordinate something that is a lie? I think that's a really good point. I think they can, or they can be deceived. Susan writes, I grew up in the church, I'm 65, and I've never heard anything other than that the witnesses saw the book physically. So Susan is reflecting what many of us were surprised to read, that in some instances, the witnesses talked about what Joshua wrote as second sight, or the eyes of our understanding, which is a point that Grant Palmer brings up in his book, An Insider View of Mormon Origins. Again, maybe the historical record is murky there. What's not murky is that definitely this idea of spiritual eyes and second sight was heavily interwoven in the perspective of the people
and
that were witnesses.
Yeah, we don't understand that from a 21st century perspective. We assume that these things, when somebody says, I touched the plates and I saw the plates, obviously we are taking that in a literal way. We don't take into consideration that a lot of these men were very much into magic at the time, like dreaming and seeing God, and second sight, having divining rods and seer stones and treasure hunting and all that. That was totally just normal. And so when you take that and you write it in a very literal way, over time, as that magic has disappeared, we now take it in a very literal way. And the church doesn't correct it. They allow us all to assume that it did happen, literally.
These were superstitious people. Joseph was running around claiming that he could find buried treasure, taking people to these supposed caves or burial sites, saying that he could see the treasure in the ground. Oh, but that the angels withdrew the treasure. Like, these are kooky, superstitious people to start with. And that's who Joseph chose in many instances as his followers. So it's possible they were lying. It's also possible that Joseph just fooled them like the charlatan that he, likely was in that context.
Well, I think they wanted to believe too. It was exciting.
Oh, for sure.
I mean, gosh, and a testament to that is that the majority of the witnesses follow after Joseph Smith. They followed a guy by the name of James Strang.
Yeah,
And I know you mentioned that, but he received supposedly revelation from God that he needed to translate the brass plates that were given to him that Laban had, and he actually translated them, and some of the same witnesses came along for that ride as well. And so even though they never denied their testimony, I mean, can you imagine denying your testimony of something that you said you saw once? That would completely ruin your credibility. You know what I mean? I don't think these guys ever denied seeing it in a vision. Of course they're not going to ever go back on that, because that completely would ruin their character, right? But the fact that they're catching on to other ideas out there that are just blatant frauds, just says a lot about who these men were.
Yeah, and I think it was David Whitmer that wrote this pamphlet that basically said, I still believe the Book of Mormon, is of divine origins. But Joseph Smith, that stuff about Melchizedek priesthood, Joseph made all that crap up. That never happened. He never told us about any of that. I don't know where he got that. And it's just another example of the witnesses basically wanting to say, on the one hand, that, they didn't lie about the Book of Mormon, but they're so willing to throw Joseph under the bus later. Really quickly, Heath makes the important point that you can't talk to Thomas S. Monson. And that's true about the apostles and the general authorities. They'll only talk to you in secret, private, behind closed doors. They don't want you to record the conversation. But none of them, they won't even sign their names to the essays. They want to be able to say, well, the scholars wrote the essays if the essays are wrong. Even though the First Presidency approved them, their names aren't on them, so that if there's anything wrong there, it's someone else's fault. And just the inaccessibility of the First Presidency, the Quorum of the 12, and the general authorities is totally suspect and unacceptable. Heath makes that point. I think that's a really important point. David says that if investigators were able to make an informed, logical decision about the church, given all the evidence, a few would ever really join the church. My dear friend Melissa Wells, who I grew up with, hello, Melissa, she was surprised to hear what we just told about the Prince family. Yes, Melissa Wells, that did happen to the Prince family. They were completely maligned and thrown under the bus by people that they served for decades. All right. And then Bethany writes, the number one sign of a cult is you will never find success or happiness, is when they tell people you will never find success or happiness outside of the group. And Thomas McConkie once told me, the sign of a cult is any organization that won't let you leave it with your dignity intact. And I think that's a really important point. The church needs to let people leave with dignity.